James Barrett never expected his job as Earth's first cultural safety liaison to involve explaining why humans shouldn't eat Tide Pods to a group of concerned aliens. Yet here he was, standing before the Zephyrian High Council, trying to convince them that the warning labels on Earth's everyday products weren't actually part of an elaborate artistic movement. The Zephyrians, with their iridescent skin and floating orb-like heads, had arrived on Earth 3 months ago. They were a peaceful species with advanced technology and a genuine desire to establish diplomatic relations. There was just one small problem: they had absolutely no concept of danger. "Esteemed Council," James began, adjusting his tie nervously, "the skull and crossbones symbol isn't actually a celebration of human skeletal appreciation." He gestured to the holographic display showing various warning labels from Earth. "It's a warning sign that means, deadly poison." First Counselor Lumina's orb head pulsed with a soft blue light, indicating confusion. "But why would you create such intricate imagery for your toxic sustenance containers? Surely this reflects a deep cultural significance." James suppressed a sigh. This was his 14th attempt to explain warning labels to the Zephyrians. Their civilization had evolved without predators, natural disasters, or any concept of physical harm. Their advanced technology had eliminated all dangers before they developed consciousness. As a result, they viewed Earth's numerous warning signs and safety measures as fascinating cultural artifacts. Yesterday, Second Counselor Vex chimed in, their voice musical and enthusiastic. "We observed humans performing what we assumed was a sacred ritual at a construction site. They wore yellow protective helmets and orange ceremonial vests. We were deeply moved by their dedication to this daily ceremony." James pinched the bridge of his nose. "Those are safety measures to prevent injury, not ceremonial garments." "Prevent injury?" Third Counselor ZYX's head orb flickered with rainbow patterns, their species equivalent of raised eyebrows. "Is this another one of your charming Earth metaphors?" Before James could respond, an alarm blared through the council chamber. Red lights flashed, and a computerized voice announced, "Warning, fire detection system activated. Please proceed to the nearest exit." The humans in the room immediately stood and began moving toward the emergency exits. The Zephyrians, however, remained seated, watching with fascination. "Ah, another impromptu performance." First Counselor Lumina exclaimed delightedly. "Humans are so spontaneous with their cultural expressions." James fought the urge to scream. "This isn't a performance. There might be a fire. We need to evacuate." "Fire?" Second Counselor Vex's orb pulsed with excitement. "Is that the fascinating oxidation process you mentioned in last week's cultural exchange? How thoughtful of you to arrange a live demonstration." The smell of smoke began to waft through the air conditioning system. James could see wisps of gray seeping under a door at the far end of the chamber. The human diplomatic staff were already filing out, but the Zephyrians remained seated, recording the event with their bio-optical sensors. "Look how the smoke adds atmosphere to the performance." Third Counselor ZYX commented. "The attention to theatrical detail is remarkable." James made a split-second decision. He grabbed a water pitcher from the council table and hurled it at the nearest smoke detector. The sprinkler system activated immediately, dousing everyone in the room. The Zephyrians finally moved, but only to better observe the water droplets falling through the air. "The choreography of this ritual is exquisite." First Counselor Lumina's voice rang with joy as water cascaded down their iridescent form. "The way you integrated the building's hydration system is simply inspired." Eventually, after the fire was contained and everyone was safely outside, James stood dripping wet before the equally soaked but thoroughly entertained Zephyrian Council. The fire had turned out to be an overheated coffee maker in the adjacent break room. "I believe," First Counselor Lumina announced, "we should incorporate these spontaneous emergency rituals into our regular cultural exchange programs. The energy, the movement, the integration of environmental elements, it's all quite magnificent." James slumped against a wall, wondering if perhaps he should have pursued his original career plan of teaching cats to dance. At least cats understood the concept of self-preservation, even if they chose to ignore it. As the council members enthusiastically discussed plans to recreate the emergency ritual, at their next diplomatic function, James pulled out his tablet and began drafting his daily report to Earth's diplomatic corps. The subject line read, Day 92, still unable to convince aliens that danger exists. They think fire alarms are performance art. Send help. Or coffee. Actually, just send coffee. 3 weeks after the fire alarm performance, James found himself staring in horror at what the Zephyrians had done to Times Square. Every surface, from the giant billboards to the sidewalks, had been covered in a soft, bouncy material that resembled colorful bubble wrap. Tourists were bouncing experimentally on the cushioned ground while Zephyrian engineers floated nearby, their orb heads glowing with pride. "We have implemented Phase 1 of Operation Human Protection," announced Technical Director Naira, their crystalline form shimmering with enthusiasm. "After studying your warning signs and safety measures, we realized that humans must require extensive environmental modification for optimal survival." James watched as a hot dog vendor attempted to serve customers from his cart, which had been entirely encased in what looked like iridescent foam padding. The mustard dispenser now required a retinal scan and 3 separate safety confirmations before it would release a single drop. "This is really not necessary," James tried to explain. "Humans have managed just fine for thousands of years without cushioned sidewalks. But we observe that humans constantly tell each other to be careful and watch your step," Naira countered, their head orb pulsing with concern. "Clearly, walking is one of your most dangerous activities." Before James could argue, a commotion erupted nearby. A group of Zephyrian engineers had cornered a street performer, a juggler, and were attempting to replace his bowling pins with what appeared to be holographic replicas. "Please accept these non-corporeal alternatives," one engineer pleaded. "They provide the same visual experience without the risk of, what was that fascinating term? Ah yes, bonking one's head." The juggler clutched his pins protectively while trying to explain that the risk was part of the entertainment. The Zephyrians recorded his protests with growing fascination, apparently interpreting his resistance as some sort of traditional human ritual. "Director Naira," James said carefully, "while we appreciate your concern, this level of intervention is excessive." He gestured to a nearby traffic light, which now included a detailed holographic simulation of potential traffic scenarios and a 5-minute warning meditation before changing colors. "Excessive?" Naira's form flickered with confusion. "But we haven't even implemented the atmospheric cushioning system yet. Or the mandatory anti-gravity fields for all vertical transitions above 2 centimeters." James choked on his coffee. "The what?" "Oh, yes." Naira brightened literally, their crystalline structure emitting a soft glow of excitement. "We noticed humans seem very concerned about falling. We're developing a citywide system that will automatically catch anyone who trips. We've also designed mandatory personal force fields for all humans under the age of, what's your species' maximum lifespan again? That's not, we don't." James stumbled over his words, trying to find a diplomatic way to say, "Please stop bubble wrapping our planet." He was interrupted by a screech of tires as a taxi driver discovered that his brakes had been replaced with what the Zephyrians called gradual deceleration fields. The taxi slowly, very slowly, came to a stop, surrounded by a shimming bubble of energy. The driver emerged, shouting colorful New York expressions that the Zephyrians eagerly recorded as examples of human stress relief vocalizations. "Fascinating," Naira commented. "We must add these new phrases to our cultural database. Though we're still trying to understand why humans invoke various deities when experiencing our safety improvements." James watched as a businessman attempted to take a sip of his morning coffee, only to be thwarted by the new, hot beverage protection protocol that required him to solve a simple math equation before the lid would open. The man's frustrated expression suggested that differential calculus before caffeine was not improving his morning. "Director Naira, James tried again, humans understand risk. We've developed our own safety measures over time. These additions are, well, they're making things more complicated. Complicated? Naira's head orb swirled with patterns of concern. But we haven't even begun installing the emotional protection grid. It's designed to detect and prevent potential instances of what you call embarrassment by projecting precautionary compliments and encouragement. Just then, a pigeon attempted to land on a nearby cushioned lamppost. The post's new wildlife protection field activated, gently catching the bird in a bubble of energy and slowly lowering it to the ground while playing soothing classical music. The pigeon looked as confused as a pigeon could possibly look. You see. Naira gestured excitedly. Even your non-sentient atmospheric fauna benefits from our protection protocols. James watched as the pigeon, now safely deposited on the ground, was immediately encased in a tiny personal force field. It waddled away, bouncing slightly with each step on the cushioned sidewalk, looking like a very disgruntled bubble within a bubble. As he stood there, watching New York City slowly transform into what looked like a cross between a bounce house and a sci-fi movie, James realized he needed a new approach. Simply explaining danger wasn't working, he needed to help the Zephyrians understand why humans sometimes needed to experience risk. But first, he had to deal with the more immediate crisis. The Zephyrians had just discovered skateboards, and their plans for recreational activity safety modifications involved something called quantum stabilization fields. James had no idea what those were, but judging by the enthusiastic glow of the engineer's head orbs, he suspected the skateboarding community wouldn't be pleased. He pulled out his tablet to draft another report, then remembered that the Zephyrians had improved it with a safety lock that required him to recite the entire UN Charter before accessing potentially dangerous applications, like email or the calculator. James sighed and looked up at the newly cushioned sky. How had they even managed that, wondering if perhaps it wasn't too late to switch careers to something simpler, like teaching quantum physics to goldfish. James stood before a small group of Zephyrians in Central Park, armed with a banana peel and a determination to finally make them understand the concept of danger. After the Great Safety Initiative had turned half of Manhattan into what locals now called the Bubble Borough, desperate times called for desperate measures. Today, he announced, we're going to conduct a practical demonstration of risk assessment. The Zephyrians' head orbs pulsed with eager anticipation, their data recorders hovering ready. Watch carefully, James said, placing the banana peel on the ground. He then proceeded to deliberately slip on it, making sure the fall was controlled but convincing. Instead of the expected concern, the Zephyrians burst into what could only be described as crystalline chimes of delight. Magnificent, exclaimed observer Crix, their form shimmering with excitement. A perfect demonstration of human gravitational entertainment. We must install fruit casings throughout the city for public amusement. James picked himself up, brushing off both his dignity and the grass stains. No, you're missing the point. This was supposed to show you that unexpected events can cause harm. Oh. Is this like your delightful pranks we've been studying? Interrupted Junior Observer Peak. We've been analyzing your human entertainment archives, particularly something called America's Funniest Home Videos. James felt a headache coming on. The Zephyrians had somehow interpreted the entire concept of physical comedy as a sophisticated form of human performance art rather than documented mishaps. His next demonstration involved a rubber spider, which he hoped would illustrate the concept of fear. The Zephyrians watched in fascination as he placed it near an unsuspecting park visitor, who jumped upon noticing it. Remarkable. Senior observer Zen's head orb swirled with academic interest. Humans have developed specialized decorative items specifically designed to trigger their startle response for recreational purposes. Such dedication to entertainment. No, you see, spiders can be dangerous, James began, but was cut off by Junior Observer Peak's enthusiastic interruption. We've already begun manufacturing improved versions of your recreational startle devices. They emit small bursts of harmless plasma and play orchestral music when activated. Just then, a jogger ran past them, causing the Zephyrians' latest safety innovation, the personal space preservation field, to activate. The jogger found himself gently but firmly redirected 30 feet to the left, his momentum preserved but his path altered to avoid any possibility of collision. Perhaps, James said desperately, we should try a different approach. He pulled out a small cactus from his bag. This plant has sharp spines for protection when touched. Before he could finish, technical specialist Vora had scanned the cactus and was projecting a holographic analysis. Fascinating. Earth flora has developed crystalline protrusions similar to our ceremonial light arrays. We must create a botanical celebration garden filled with these decorative specimens. They're not decorative, they're defensive. James protested. The spines are meant to hurt anything that. Oh, like your delightful massage devices. Crix chimed in. We've been studying human relaxation techniques. These spines must be an organic version of your acupuncture technology. James watched in horror as Vora began drafting plans for a human relaxation garden featuring what appeared to be giant, genetically modified cacti with glowing spines that played soothing whale songs when touched. The situation reached its peak when a nearby child's balloon popped. While the child barely blinked, the Zephyrians reacted with unprecedented enthusiasm. The young human has mastered atmospheric pressure manipulation for acoustic entertainment. Observer Crix declared. Quick, we must document this achievement. As the Zephyrians eagerly interviewed the bewildered child's parents about their prodigy's mastery of recreational atmospheric compression, James slumped onto a nearby bench, which, of course, had been equipped with an optimal posture maintenance field that automatically adjusted his sitting position. He watched as a squirrel attempted to bury a nut, only to be thwarted by the new ground protection matrix that the Zephyrians had installed to prevent what they called unauthorized terrestrial modifications. The squirrel sat back on its haunches, seemingly contemplating its life choices, before being gently encased in its own tiny force field, the 7th time that day. As James observed the increasingly absurd scene before him, the protected squirrel, the interviewing Zephyrians, the confused parents, and the child now being presented with an impromptu award for excellence in atmospheric entertainment, he realized he needed to completely rethink his approach. Perhaps instead of trying to explain danger to beings who had never experienced it, he needed to help them understand why humans valued their ability to face and overcome challenges. But as he watched a Zephyrian engineer excitedly install what appeared to be a precipitation interpretation field designed to transform rain into educational light shows, he wondered if perhaps he should start with something simpler. Like explaining why humans didn't need their shoes to provide running commentary on their walking technique, or why automatic force field deployment wasn't necessary every time someone sneezed. The weather forecast had predicted a severe thunderstorm, but nobody had predicted the Zephyrians' reaction to it. James stood in the middle of Times Square, watching in disbelief as hundreds of Zephyrians floated above the city, their crystalline forms reflecting the lightning in a spectacular display of colors. What a magnificent celebratory display! First Counselor Lumina announced through the citywide communication system they'd installed last week. Humans truly outdid themselves with this atmospheric light show. Thunder cracked overhead, and the Zephyrians responded with what could only be described as delighted tinkling sounds. They seemed convinced that Earth's weather patterns were an elaborate entertainment system designed for their benefit. This isn't a show, James tried explaining through his communication device, which the Zephyrians had helpfully modified to translate his words into musical tones they found more pleasing. This is a dangerous weather pattern that requires shelter and caution. Ah, yes. Technical Director Naira's voice chimed in. We've observed humans gathering in groups during these displays. Clearly a communal appreciation ritual. Before James could respond, a bolt of lightning struck one of the taller buildings, or would have, if the Zephyrians' atmospheric energy redistribution grid hadn't intercepted it. The lightning was immediately transformed into a cascade of harmless light particles that rained down over the city in heart-shaped patterns. How thoughtful. Third Counselor ZYX exclaimed. The humans have programmed their atmospheric display to include romantic elements. James watched as the Zephyrians began choreographing their movements to match the thunder, creating what they called a symphony of atmospheric appreciation. Meanwhile, actual New Yorkers huddled under the protection of the nearest safety bubbles, watching the aliens perform their impromptu aerial ballet with a mixture of confusion and resigned acceptance. The situation took an unexpected turn when the storm intensified. Wind speeds increased dramatically, and the rain became torrential. To the Zephyrians, this was simply Act 2 of the performance. The special effects are remarkable. Second Counselor Vex broadcasted enthusiastically. The way humans have harnessed their planetary rotation to create wind patterns is simply inspired. James was about to explain that humans had absolutely no control over the weather when he noticed something concerning. The Zephyrians' safety systems, overwhelmed by the storm's intensity, were beginning to flicker. Everyone, he called out, noting the way the force fields were starting to destabilize. Perhaps we should move this appreciation ceremony indoors. But we haven't reached the crescendo. Naira protested. According to our analysis of human entertainment patterns, there should be a grand finale. As if on cue, a massive gust of wind swept through the city, strong enough to affect even the Zephyrians' levitation abilities. For the first time since their arrival on Earth, James saw something new in their oscillating orb heads: uncertainty. This atmospheric choreography seems unusually vigorous, First Counselor Lumina observed, their usually steady hover becoming slightly wobbly. Another gust of wind sent a piece of debris flying past them, barely deflected by their weakening force fields. The Zephyrians watched its trajectory with what could only be described as dawning comprehension. Fascinating, Third Counselor ZYX said slowly, their head orb pulsing with new patterns James had never seen before. Are you suggesting that these atmospheric conditions are not intentional? That's what I've been trying to tell you. James shouted over the wind. Nature isn't a performance, it's a force that exists independently of our control or desires. The Zephyrians hung in the air, processing this information as rain swirled around their crystalline forms. Then, in a moment that would later be marked in both human and Zephyrian historical records, First Counselor Lumina said something unprecedented. Perhaps, we should seek shelter. It was the first time any Zephyrian had ever acknowledged the need for protection from natural forces. James felt like he was witnessing a pivotal moment in interspecies relations, or would have, if he wasn't so busy helping coordinate the suddenly very urgent evacuation of several hundred floating aliens who had just discovered the concept of weather-related risk. As they huddled inside the safety of Grand Central Terminal, which the Zephyrians had thankfully not yet equipped with their public transport enhancement field, James noticed something remarkable. The aliens were watching the storm through the windows with a completely new expression in their swirling orb heads. It wasn't fear exactly, but rather a kind of respectful awe. We may, First Counselor Lumina announced thoughtfully, need to revise some of our assumptions about Earth's environmental features. James smiled, realizing that sometimes the best way to understand danger was to experience it firsthand, even if you were an advanced alien species that had previously considered thunder to be a form of atmospheric applause. A week after the storm incident, James found himself in an unprecedented situation. The Zephyrians had called an emergency council meeting to discuss the concept of uncontrollable variables, their new favorite term for anything that their technology couldn't fully protect against. The council chamber had been significantly modified. Gone were the excessive safety bubbles and force fields. Instead, there was just one modest, essential protection grid humming quietly in the background. James considered this a major victory, even if it did still insist on giving safety tips in 7 languages whenever someone sneezed. After careful analysis of recent events, First Counselor Lumina began, their head orb pulsing with a more subdued glow than usual. We have come to several important conclusions about Earth and its inhabitants. The counselor projected a holographic display showing various Earth phenomena, storms, waves, volcanoes, and, much to James's amusement, a particularly grumpy-looking goose. We now understand that your planet maintains certain, autonomous systems that cannot and perhaps should not be fully controlled. Furthermore, Lumina continued, their crystalline form shifting to a more formal configuration, we have observed that humans have developed remarkable adaptive capabilities in response to these systems. Though we still question the necessity of what you call extreme sports, Second Counselor Vex interjected, displaying footage of a skydiver. Surely launching oneself from perfectly functional aircraft serves no practical purpose. James cleared his throat. Actually, that's something I'd like to address. Humans don't just adapt to risk, we sometimes actively seek it out, in controlled ways, to challenge ourselves and grow. The council members' head orbs swirled with various patterns of confusion and curiosity. Technical Director Naira, who had been quietly recalibrating their safety protocols, looked up with interest. You mean to say, Naira asked, that humans intentionally place themselves in situations of uncertain outcome, for personal development? Exactly. James seized the moment. It's not that we don't appreciate safety, we do. But we've learned that some degree of risk, when properly managed, can lead to innovation, discovery, and personal growth. The Zephyrians processed this information, their head orbs pulsing in synchronized patterns that James had learned indicated deep contemplation. Finally, First Counselor Lumina spoke. We propose a compromise. We will scale back our safety implementations to what you consider reasonable levels, but in exchange, we request your assistance in understanding this concept of beneficial risk. And so began what would later be known as the Great Safety Scaleback. Over the next few days, New York gradually returned to its normal state of controlled chaos. The cushioned sidewalks were removed, though some residents admitted they'd missed them, the excessive force fields were deactivated, and the public transportation system no longer required a safety quiz before allowing passengers to board. The Zephyrians, meanwhile, began their own experiments with controlled risk-taking. They started small, deliberately allowing their personal force fields to flicker for a few seconds, trying Earth foods without first analyzing their molecular structure, and even, in what was considered a radical move, attending a human comedy show without first studying the joke patterns. The breakthrough moment came during a cultural exchange event in Central Park. A Zephyrian engineer, inspired by human children playing, attempted to climb a tree, something previously unthinkable in their risk-free society. When they reached the top, their head orb glowing with unprecedented patterns of excitement and achievement, James realized they had finally grasped what humans had known all along: the sweetest victories often come with a hint of uncertainty. First Counselor Lumina approached James as they watched the engineer carefully make their way back down. We have a saying in our culture, they said, their voice containing new harmonics James had never heard before. Evolution comes from adaptation. Perhaps, we had adapted too perfectly to safety. James nodded, watching as more Zephyrians cautiously approached the tree, their head orbs glowing with curiosity. And maybe we humans could learn something about reasonable precautions from you, he admitted, thinking of some of humanity's more questionable risk-taking behaviors. The Council agreed to maintain certain practical safety measures, the emergency response systems, weather warnings, and basic force fields for genuine hazards. But they also established the Human Risk Assessment Initiative, a program designed to help Zephyrians understand and experience controlled challenges. As James watched a group of Zephyrian scientists tentatively trying to eat ice cream without temperature stabilization fields, and discovering brain freeze for the first time, he realized that sometimes the best diplomatic victories come not from changing others completely, but from helping them find their own path to understanding. Though he did have to step in when one particularly enthusiastic Zephyrian suggested they try understanding the human concept of parkour, some cultural exchanges, he decided, were better left for future negotiations.